Frank Gardner, our security correspondent, thank you very much for now. We'll be joining you again a little bit later this morning here on BBC News. Thank you for joining us. Today live from Jerusalem. Welcome to our viewers who are joining us in the UK and around the world. This is BBC News. We have pictures now that we're looking at is of Air Force One. Joe Biden, the US president, has landed in Israel in the midst of this escalating situation with tensions so high across the region, particularly as his plane took off from the United States yesterday when news and devastating pictures were appearing of the loss of life, hundreds of Gaza civilians inside an overcrowded hospital following an explosion. Since then, we've had Israelis and Palestinians blaming one another for that explosion. Israel presenting evidence, it said today, to show that it was not behind the explosion, but rather a malfunctioning rocket by Islamic Jihad. We see here Joe Biden coming down the steps as he arrives here in Israel. I mean, what must be going on in his mind? Greeting Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister. The men know each other well. They've known each other for decades. President Biden has been coming to this region for 50 years now. The US says over and over again what a close ally Israel is, that it will unwaveringly stand by the side of Israel. But it has also expressed deep concern about the unfolding and increasing humanitarian crisis in Gaza at the moment. Israel has tightened its siege on the Gaza Strip. No food, water, fuel, medicine coming in to the Strip, and relentless aerial bombardments following that massive loss of life, the murder of 1,400 Israelis inside Israel 10 days ago by militants who are coming out of Gaza. And we can now join our international correspondent, Lise Doucette, who's in southern Israel, very close to the border with Gaza. We just saw those pictures of Air Force One landing in Tel Aviv. We saw Joe Biden greeting Israel's prime minister and heading off for talks with him and the Israeli war cabinet today. Also watching this meeting very, very closely are leaders across the Arab world, not just Palestinian leaders, and also citizens, people across the Arab world who have been demonstrating on the streets about the loss of life in Gaza these last days. Thank you so much, Lise Doucette, our international correspondent there, talking about Joe Biden, US President Joe Biden, arriving in this region for an exceptional visit. A US president, a hastily organized, very unusual, a hastily organized visit to a region which sees conflict that threatens to escalate. Of course, his visit has been hugely complicated even further by the devastating deaths last night at a hospital in the Gaza Strip, with hundreds of civilians killed there. Israel and the Palestinians have accused one another of being responsible for those explosions. But in the meantime, the situation for civilians on the ground is absolutely dire. Our Gaza correspondent, Rushdie Abu Alouf, is in Gaza and has been reporting for us. We were just hearing there Admiral Daniel Hagari, a spokesman for the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. He was addressing claims by the Palestinian leadership that Israel was behind an explosion at an overcrowded Gazan hospital yesterday evening, in which hundreds of Gazan civilians died at that hospital, men, women and children. Israel claiming that actually it was a malfunctioning rocket fired by the Islamic Jihad militant group at Israel that actually ended up causing an explosion in the hospital. Hamas, which governs the Gaza Strip and which is seen and labelled as a terrorist organisation by the US, the UK and many other Western governments, insists that Israel is to blame for that. Of course, Israel has been carrying out aerial bombardments across the Gaza Strip for the last 10 days since militants from Gaza, mainly from Hamas, entered Israel, killed 1,400 people. We have US President Joe Biden, who just recently touched down in Israel. We can see him there coming out of Air Force One. He will be holding talks with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying, of course, he remains and is a strong ally of Israel, but emphasising concerns about the developing dire humanitarian situation inside the Gaza Strip, pressing Israel to allow supplies, humanitarian supplies, medicine, food, water to enter the Gaza Strip. Do stay with us here on BBC News, where we will continue to bring you the very latest of the developing. This is BBC News. I'm Katya Adler, speaking to you live from Jerusalem. The headlines this hour: Joe Biden is in Israel for talks with Benjamin Netanyahu's government as Jordan cancels a planned summit with Arab leaders. Israel and the Palestinians are blaming each other for an explosion at a hospital in Gaza that's said to have killed hundreds of people. The Israeli army has denied responsibility for the explosion, and they blamed the damage on a failed rocket launch by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The blast sent shockwaves through the region, with Palestinians and others across the region staging protests. So we had Palestinian protests in the West Bank and laying the blame on Israel. Well, the situation remains tense, not just in the south, with the Gaza Strip and inside the Gaza Strip, but in northern Israel as well, near the border with Lebanon. Parts of the Lebanese side of the border are controlled by Hezbollah, a militant organisation which, like Hamas, has close links to Iran. Hamas, of course, governs the Gaza Strip and is seen as a terrorist organisation by the UK, the US and other Western governments. Well, earlier this week, Israel said its forces had killed 4 militants in the north who were trying to cross the border. Israel has established a wide buffer zone near the border for what it says are security reasons. We can be joined now by our Middle East correspondent, Anna Foster, in northern Israel, close to that boundary with Lebanon. Anna, how tense does that situation remain? Because if you walk around Israel, if you look at the papers, if you chat to people, they are really concerned that they could be facing an escalation of this crisis and violence on several different fronts. I think we've just lost our Middle East correspondent, Anna Foster there. Anna was filling us in about the exchanges of fire between Israel's defense forces and the Hezbollah militia in southern Lebanon. The risk there, Hezbollah has threatened, and it is heavily and powerfully armed, and that it will launch its might against Israel if the situation in Gaza for civilians, which is already dire, gets any worse. Anna was talking to us there about what that trigger could be in the current situation, and hopefully we'll be joining her a little bit later. I can speak now to Nomi Bar Yaakov, Associate Fellow in the International Security Programme at Chatham House in London. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's go back, please, to what happened at the Al Ali hospital, that hospital in Gaza, overcrowded, hit by an explosion yesterday in which hundreds of civilians died. And that is going to have a big impact on the massive VIP visit here today. Joe Biden, the US president, currently in talks with Israel's government, and who had been hoping then to go on to Amman in Jordan for a summit with Arab leaders in the hope of putting some calm into this situation. What does it look like now for him? I'm so sorry to interrupt you there, but we are just seeing live pictures of Joe Biden sitting with Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. And we are expecting them now to make some public statements. They hugged each other when they met in Israel before. Let's listen in.
Reflects the overwhelming will of the American people. I've seen your support every day in the depth and breadth of cooperation that we have had since the great alliance between our two nations. We see that support in your steadfast commitment to provide Israel with the tools we need to defend ourselves. Thank you. Thank
Some questions? We've just been listening to Joe Biden, the President of the United States, who has arrived in Israel for talks with Israel's government, giving some press statements there alongside Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. They haven't taken any questions, it seems, at the end of those press statements. Joe Biden underlined himself how exceptional, unusual his visit is here today. This is a region at war with a threat of escalation in the region. Highly unusual for a US president to arrive under those circumstances. In fact, Israel's Prime Minister just said the first US president to come to Israel in a time of war. But Joe Biden said it was important to him to deliver the US message in person, he said. Normally it would be left to his Secretary of State, Blinken, who has been in the region a lot, but he wanted to come himself, he said, and he delivered that message that we have heard so often from him, the steadfast friendship that the US has for Israel, the fact that it wants to help guarantee its security, something that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu thanked him very much for. Of course, the US gives a lot of military equipment to the Israeli Defense Forces, and in the current situation, tense situation, the US has sent 2 aircraft carriers to the region as well as that. There is so much to have a look at, even in those rather brief press statements between the US President and Israel's Prime Minister. So joining me to analyse those is Nomi Bar Yaakov, an Associate Fellow in International Security Programme at Chatham House in London. Nomi Bar Yaakov, what did you make of Joe Biden's statement? We knew he was going to mention concerns about the dire humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza, but he spent a lot of time emphasising the solidarity with Israel there, didn't he?
If Israel or Egypt won't open the Rafah crossing for aid, then the situation in Gaza will deteriorate rapidly, and the situation in the region.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Nomi Bar-Yaakov from Chatham House talking about the dire situation in Gaza at the time when the US president here is talking about morality in the region. Live from Jerusalem, this is BBC News. Joe Biden arrived in Israel for talks with Benjamin Netanyahu's government as Jordan cancels a planned summit with Arab leaders. His arrival comes as Israel and Hamas blame each other for an explosion at a hospital in Gaza that's said to have killed hundreds. This was Joe Biden a few minutes ago.
Based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you.
Israel's army has denied responsibility for the explosion, blaming a failed rocket launch by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The blast sent shockwaves through the region, with Palestinians staging protests across the West Bank. Hello and welcome to our viewers around the world and those in the UK. I'm Katya Adler and we are broadcasting live from Jerusalem from this region gripped by violence and death, with fears the situation could well escalate. The US President Joe Biden has arrived in Israel. This was always a diplomatically risky visit, a US president arriving in the middle of a fast-paced war. But his role here and what he can hope to achieve today has been hugely complicated by the devastating deaths last night of hundreds of civilians in Gaza in an explosion in an overcrowded hospital. President Biden has already begun his meeting with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The two leaders had these comments before they went behind closed doors for more talks. And we were just watching comments not long ago made by Joe Biden, the US president, who's arrived in Israel for talks today. The first time Israel's prime minister pointed out, sitting next to him, that a US president has come to Israel in a time of war. Well, to have a look at the public statements made by the two leaders, we can chat to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, who is on the Israel-Gaza boundary at the moment. Lise, you were, of course, watching and listening carefully. Did anything surprise you of those comments? We've been speaking earlier about how President Biden was expected to express his solidarity, as he always does, with Israel, but also to be quite outspoken of the need to do something about the increasingly dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Lise Doucette on the Israel-Gaza border there. Thank you very much joining us, our international correspondent, Lise Doucette there. Well, we were talking about the explosion at that Gaza hospital. Palestinian officials, as we were saying, have directly blamed Israel for striking it. Israel has been bombarding the Gaza Strip with air raids since the massacre by Hamas 10 days ago of 1,400 Israelis inside Israel. But also, as we were saying, Israel blames last night's deadly hospital explosion on a malfunction of a rocket intended to be aimed at Israel by the Islamic Jihad armed militant group inside Gaza. The huge number of deaths at that hospital triggered angry street protests in Palestinian cities in the West Bank and across the Arab world. Now, President Biden had been hoping to attend a summit of Arab leaders in Jordan after visiting Israel. That was cancelled after the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, pulled out following the hospital explosion. He declared 3 days of mourning for the men, women and children killed there. Well, our correspondent Rushdie Abu-Alouf is in Gaza and he's managed to reach the Al Ahli hospital. He's sent us this update from outside the building. Peter Lerner, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, spokesman for the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. Thank you for joining us now. Of course, we are talking to people across the region about the conflict at the moment between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Hamas labelled a terrorist organisation by Israel, the US, the UK and many other Western governments as well. There is death, there is trauma on both sides, and the situation threatens to escalate. We've been looking at the explosion at the hospital yesterday in Gaza that cost so many lives and has fueled anger across the Middle East region. Our correspondent Don Donison has more. And we are bringing you BBC News live from Jerusalem. Do stay with us on BBC News as we keep you up to date with Joe Biden's visit to the region.
Free speech is meaningless unless you allow people you don't like to say things you don't like.
After winning, like the people were so proud and it was so intense.
Сказав моїй дружині, треба збиратись, треба піднімати дітей. Почалась війна.
I never thought I was going to be a famous movie person.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC.
You're watching BBC News. The headlines. Joe Biden is in Israel for talks with Benjamin Netanyahu as Jordan cancels a planned summit with Arab leaders. His arrival comes as Israel and Hamas blame each other for an explosion at a hospital in Gaza that's said to have killed hundreds. President Biden says he doesn't believe Israel is at fault. The blast sent shockwaves through the region. Palestinians staged protests across the West Bank. They laid the blame on Israel for the explosion and loss of life. Hello, I'm Katya Adler and we're speaking to you live from Jerusalem today. As we've been mentioning, Palestinian officials have directly blamed Israel for striking a hospital in Gaza, which has caused hundreds of deaths. But Israel blames the night's deadly hospital explosion on a malfunction of a rocket intended to be aimed at Israel by the Islamic Jihad militant group. The huge number of deaths at the hospital triggered angry street protests, as we mentioned, in Palestinian cities, with anger across the Arab world. President Biden is now in Israel. He'd been hoping to calm tensions, attending a summit of Arab leaders in Jordan after visiting Israel. But that was cancelled when the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, pulled out of that summit following the hospital explosion and declaring 3 days of mourning for the men, women and children who died then. We've been talking about a reaction to that explosion in Gaza that cost so many lives at a hospital yesterday that Israel and the Palestinians accuse each other of triggering that explosion. There has been enormous and deep reaction to that event across the region. I'm now joined by BBC Monitoring Middle East specialist Hesham Shawish. Hesham, thanks very much for joining us. There was almost an immediate reaction, wasn't there? I mean, on social media, as the horrific pictures were coming out of that hospital as we were hearing the news. Very tense, and we're going to continue, of course, here on BBC News to talk about those tensions. Hesham Shawish from BBC Monitoring for now. Thank you very much. So there's tensions, of course, around the Gaza Strip, but the situation is also tense in northern Israel near the border with Lebanon. Parts of the Lebanese side of the border are controlled by Hezbollah militant organisation, which, like Hamas, has close links to Iran. On Tuesday, Israeli forces killed at least 4 of the group, who they said were trying to cross the border to plant explosives. Israel has established a wide buffer zone near the border, evacuating villages for what it says are security reasons, and that has raised concerns that that area could be heating up now. Well, joining us from Beirut to discuss that is Khalil Helou, a former general in the Lebanese army. Hello to you.
Hello.
Now, as we've been seeing in the past couple of hours, President Biden has arrived here in Israel for talks with Israel's government. He had then been planning to go on to Jordan for a summit and to talk to Arab leaders, the hope being his hope had been to calm the situation and to also allow a humanitarian corridor and supplies into Gaza in order to calm the wider region. But does the northern region feel calm to you right now? And that was Nomi Bar Yaakov of Chatham House talking to us there about the explosion at the Gaza hospital yesterday, in which hundreds are said to have died. An explosion that Israel has blamed on the Palestinian armed group Islamic Jihad, saying it was the misfiring of a rocket the group had aimed at Israel. Palestinian authorities have blamed the explosion squarely on Israel. This when Joe Biden comes to the region to try and calm the situation. And we see him there arriving in Israel this morning. Live from Jerusalem, this is BBC News. Joe Biden is in Israel for talks with Benjamin Netanyahu's government as Jordan cancels a planned summit with Arab leaders. He arrives as Israel and Hamas blame each other for an explosion at a hospital in Gaza that's said to have killed hundreds. The US president indicated that he doesn't believe that Israel is at fault.
I was deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team.
The Israeli army denies responsibility for the explosion, blaming a failed rocket launch by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The blast sent shockwaves through the region, with Palestinians staging protests across the West Bank. Hello and welcome to our viewers around the world and in the UK. I'm Katya Adler and we are broadcasting live from Jerusalem, from this region gripped by death and fears that the situation could escalate further. Joe Biden has arrived in Israel. It was always a risky visit, a US president arriving in the middle of a fast-paced war. But his role here and what he can actually hope to achieve today has been hugely complicated by the devastating deaths last night of hundreds of civilians in Gaza in an explosion at an overcrowded hospital where many were sheltering. That has raised the number of Gazans killed since Hamas attacked Israel 11 days ago to at least 3,500, according to a Palestinian health minister in Ramallah. Well, President Biden has been meeting Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The two leaders made these comments before going into closed-door talks. Well, let's go back now to what happened last night in Gaza at that hospital we were talking about. Palestinian officials have directly blamed Israel for striking the Al Ahli hospital. Israel has been bombarding the Gaza Strip since the massacre by Hamas of 1,400 Israelis inside Israel 11 days ago. But Israel blames last night's deadly hospital explosion on a misfunctioning of a rocket, which it said was fired by Islamic Jihad militant group inside Gaza, aiming at Israel. The huge number of deaths at the hospital has triggered angry street protests across the Middle East, and including by Palestinians around the West Bank. President Biden had been hoping to attend a summit of Arab leaders, as we were just discussing with Lise there, in Jordan after visiting Israel, where he is now. That summit, though, was cancelled after the president of the Palestinian Authority pulled out after the hospital explosion. He declared 3 days of mourning for the men, women and children killed there. Well, our correspondent Rushdie Abu Alouf is in Gaza, and he managed to reach Al Ahli Hospital, and he sent us this update from outside the building. And that was Daniel Hagari, spokesman for Israel's Defense Forces, the IDF, laying out Israel's argument that it was not to blame for an explosion last night at an overcrowded hospital in Gaza, in which hundreds are said to have been killed. Very distressing images coming out of that incident. The Palestinian governors of Gaza, Hamas, also labelled a terrorist organisation by the US and UK, insist Israel was definitely to blame. US President Joe Biden is in Israel today and appeared to say that he had seen Israel's arguments and believed that Israel was not to blame. But emotions have been even further inflamed as a result of that mass loss of life at that one explosion yesterday in Gaza. Protests across the streets in much of the Arab world. Here's our correspondent, John Donnison. National trauma in Israel following that massacre of 1,400 in Israel and 200 hostages which were taken into Gaza. You can see the security there. Joe Biden is in Israel today trying to impose some calm, he hopes.
Download the BBC News app now and get the latest headlines as they happen. Personalise your app to learn more about the stories you care about. Stay up to date. Download the BBC News app.
This is BBC News, the headlines. Joe Biden is in Israel for talks with Benjamin Netanyahu as Jordan cancels a planned summit with Arab leaders. Joe Biden's trip comes as Israel and Hamas blame each other for an explosion at a hospital in Gaza that's said to have killed hundreds. President Biden says he doesn't believe that Israel was at fault. The blast sent shockwaves through the region, Palestinians staging protests across the West Bank and laying the blame on Israel. Well, as you've heard, Palestinian officials have directly blamed Israel for striking a hospital But Israel blames last night's deadly explosion at that hospital on the malfunctioning of a rocket the Islamic Jihad militant group was firing, it said, at Israel. The huge number of deaths at the hospital triggered angry street protests in Palestinian cities in the West Bank and also across the Arab world. President Biden had been hoping to attend a summit of Arab leaders in Jordan after visiting Israel. That was cancelled when the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, pulled out following the hospital explosion. Mr. Abbas has declared 3 days of mourning for the men, women and children killed. The Palestinian health minister says the number of people killed in Gaza is now at least 3,300, with more than 13,000 wounded. That's over the last 11 days. Marwan Jalani is Director General of the Palestinian Red Crescent, and he gave this reaction to the tragic events at the hospital in Gaza last night. Well, for more on the developing situation, I'm joined by Paul Adams, our diplomatic correspondent. Paul, diplomatic correspondent, attempts at diplomacy today by Joe Biden in the region, the first US president to come to Israel during a war. That's how he was greeted by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But it wasn't supposed to stop at Israel, was it? He had been supposed to go on to Amman and talk to Arab leaders there, and that was cancelled after that terrible explosion and loss of life at the Gaza hospital. We're talking about it. So has that limited the effectiveness he even could have in this visit? We'll have to leave it for the moment now. Paul, thank you so much for joining us there. Paul Adams, our diplomatic correspondent. Well, the situation remains tense, not just in and around Gaza, but in northern Israel as well, near the border with Lebanon. Parts of the Lebanese side of the border are controlled by Hezbollah, a militant organisation which, like Hamas, has close links to Iran. On Tuesday, Israeli forces killed at least 4 of the group's fighters, who they said were trying to cross the border to plant explosives. Israel has established a wide buffer zone near the border, and it's evacuated villages for what it says are security reasons, which raises concern about what might happen there next. Well, let's hear now from a former general in the Lebanese army, Khalil Helou. I asked him whether he thought there was a real possibility of escalation of hostilities across that boundary. We can take you back to those live pictures from the Palestinian city of Ramallah in the West Bank. Crowds gathering, angry at Israel, they say. There was an explosion at a Gaza hospital yesterday where hundreds are said to have died. Palestinian leaders have blamed that explosion on Israel. Israel has been carrying out air bombardments across the Gaza Strip for the last 11 days since militants from Gaza crossed over into Israel, killing 1,400 people, massacring them and taking 200 people hostage, including children and the elderly. Israel insists it was not to blame. This crowd also angry with Palestinian president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, they say, for being weak in the face of this developing humanitarian crisis. And all the while here in Israel, Joe Biden has arrived to try, yes, and say he's a close ally of Israel, but urging for some calm. We can see security there outside the talks that Joe Biden is holding with Israel's Prime Minister and his war cabinet as well. His message that the US stands close to Israel, but it has to think of civilians inside Gaza as well, with a risk of escalation to the wider region. You're watching BBC News. Please stay with us.
Hello, you're watching BBC News. I'm Catherine Biarahanga, and we're just going to show you live scenes from the House of Commons, where shortly we will have Prime Minister's questions. Rishi Sunak will be answering questions for the first time since the political party conferences and the first time since the start of the Israel-Gaza war. Well, watching it all with us will be our political correspondent, Helen Catt, who is live at Westminster. Ellen, as we mentioned there, the Israel-Gaza war is a major issue here, politically in the UK as well. How much is it going to be reflected in today's session?